Hello, everyone. This is Rihanna Hanson with SPED 5110 Special Education Law. I just wanted to start off this presentation by congratulating everybody on finishing this course. That's so exciting, and I know that a lot of us are in the throes of beginning of the school year, so I wanted to send out best wishes to you guys as well. I'd like to get into my white paper presentation. I did mine on speaking up, standing out, and why student-led IEPs matter. So essentially, student-centered IEPs, why they're important, and how to help students really take the reins when it comes to their IEPs. So I want to give you a little bit of context here. Um, some background information on myself. I've actually worked in special education in some capacity for the last 12 to 13 years, and I spent the bulk of that working in some form of transition services, be it a para as an occupational preparation, and eventually a teacher. And I've also taught vocational and life skills at a nonprofit. Transitions is my favorite, and I absolutely love seeing students step into themselves and figure out what life looks like for them. So when I saw this white paper and learned a little bit more about it, I was excited. I was like, boom, I'm going to do mine on transitions. I got this in the bag. But as I did more research, I realized that there's more to this than just transitions. And at one point, I had a thought to myself. I was like, okay, Utah, I see you. I see you starting the transition process at 14, 2 years ahead of the like federally mandated 16. Like that's good. That's good. But what about the student-centered planning process? When do we teach students to become actively involved in their IEPs? Because if we're starting at 14 or when they enter high school, then we've missed the mark entirely. Okay? By high school, most students with disabilities will have experienced some form of educational trauma or have, some form of educational burnout, right? And that leads them to become kind of apathetic because they feel like they've been left out of the conversation and like they have no meaningful role in developing their IEPs. They feel minimized. And the question for them becomes, what's the point? No one's going to listen to me anyways. And that's a problem because students who feel like their voices don't matter become adults who feel like their voices don't matter. And not only is that sad, but that's dangerous. And additionally, as far as IEPs go, when we don't involve students meaningfully in that process, it leads to IEPs that don't align with what the student actually needs. The IEP doesn't align with what they're actually interested in, and it doesn't match up with their long-term goals. Okay, so we really want to get away from that. So let's talk a bit about what the law says. And this was kind of interesting to me because we all know that parents and guardians are legally required to be part or have a seat at the IEP table. But students, the person who the IEP is about, are not. In fact, students are not legally required to be in the IEP meeting, and they're not legally required really to participate in the IEP planning process until 16, when they can start participating in transitions. And that's not even necessarily by coming to the meeting, that's through transition assessments. Isn't that interesting? Now, IDA, even though it doesn't legally mandate it, and OSEP strongly encourages schools to help students to become more actively involved in their IEPs. Okay, they want schools to participate, or excuse me, to teach students to participate and advocate for themselves. Okay, so let's talk about what is really going on right now in the schools. And there was a study that showed that students attended their IEPs 30% of the time. Now, ironically, for myself, when I read that, I was like, actually, it's kind of on par for what I was thinking. What really made my jaw drop was students spend 3% of the time in the IEP meeting, students speak 3% of the time. The rest of the time is dominated by adults. And that really blew my mind. And this is where I want to say physical attendance does not equal meaningful participation. In fact, I kind of would like everyone to think for a second. Imagine that you're a student with a disability and you walk into a meeting where an adult or where there's lots of adults and they're all talking about your future, and no one stops to really ask you about your goals. They don't really ask you about what your strengths are or what are areas that you feel you need to improve on. They don't ask you what you're interested in. Is that a meeting you'd really want to be a part of? Would you really care at that point? I think a lot of people probably wouldn't, right? And this is actually, so this 3%, um, I don't know. My notes say here, studies show that students, especially those with autism or intellectual disabilities, speak very little in IEP meetings. And this is due to lack of preparation and low expectation. That makes things worse. And that's on part with both the student and the educator. Okay? And it's on the educator to make sure that we're all prepared, including the student, right? So, I look at it as kind of like feeding a monster, you know. If we're not teaching students to be actively engaged in their IEP, it kind of feeds the monster for some educators who might feel like the student doesn't care. And for the student, it feeds the monster of what's the point? No one, like, no one's going to listen to me anyways. We really want to get away from that. Okay. And part of that is by teaching self determination. Okay. So let's talk about self determination and why it matters. So, students who learn self determination skills, I want you to think for a second, like just picture one of your students as an adult. Okay. Because if we're part of student centered planning for IEPs, is teaching self determination skills. So, students who are taught self determination skills are, as adults, more likely to get and keep jobs. They're more likely to live independently, and they're more likely to become better decision makers or more informed decision makers. Okay, so they are more likely to learn how to set goals and keep goals, which is great. Okay, these skills can be developed through through active engagement in their IEPs. All right, so I know now we've kind of talked a bit about, all right, Rihanna, I know what the problem is. I know why it matters. How do I do that? Well, it starts at the foundation, okay? And one of the things we start with first is teaching IEP terminology. And I know that as sped educators, speducators, maybe we're chuckling to ourselves a little bit because we all know there's like about 50,000 different acronyms. And yes, that is an over exaggeration, but there's a lot, okay? Um, I like to think of it as like when I'm teaching my daughter how to walk across the parking lot safely. I tell her, you might be able to see a car, you might see them coming, but they don't necessarily see you. And it's kind of the same thing with special education language and terminology. We might know what we're saying, but that doesn't mean that the parent knows what we're saying, and that definitely doesn't mean that the student knows what we're saying. So we want to teach the students a bit about the terminology. What are they going to hear? Okay? And we can also, something I thought that was pretty interesting is doing role play. So practicing role play IEP scenarios, telling them what questions they're going to hear and helping them decide how they're going to respond. Okay. We can also increase student rules. All right. So I think I teach in high school. So I'm always thinking of like transition services and okay, what would my high school students feel comfortable with? They could, for starters, introduce members of the IEP team. How cool would that be, to teach them or to let them know who's going to be there and for them to see a room full of people who care about them? Wouldn't that be cool to help that like shift in mindset happen there instead of a room full of strangers? Um, we can also you can also create visual cues for meeting participation. And something that I kind of liked is helping students, regardless of age, create some form of a presentation or a portfolio of how they're doing in their classes. That helps to build accountability for students, and it helps them to get an idea of where they're at. And this can happen at any age, even in elementary school, because you can ask them, okay, so what's your favorite subject? What do you like to learn about? What are your strengths? What are areas that you'd like to work on? Okay? What are your interests? Those are things that can be done as well. Okay, and a really cool curriculum that implements this is Whose Future Is It Anyways? And this, I'm still looking into this curriculum, but I like it because at the core is this idea that any student, regardless of ability, can participate meaningfully in their IEP. So it doesn't matter if they're high functioning or if they're low functioning, there is room for everybody at the table. Okay, and this Whose Future Is It Anyway? Kind of gets at it's three tiered. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here real quick. Um, ah, okay, so it starts with three stages. It has awareness, decision making, and participation. Okay, and the idea is it wants to, or here we go. Sorry. Okay, so they're trying to get students to explore their strengths, what are their needs and their preferences, and then it helps students to start learning how to set goals, like what's a SMART goal, and how to evaluate the goals that they're making. Okay, and then participate. So it teaches students how to lead and contribute to the meeting. Okay, so again, just getting at that, research shows significant improvements in self determination and planning skills among program participants. So this is a really cool curriculum to check out if you're a transition teacher. I myself want to look more into this, but that is awesome. And another thing that it does, it touches on teaching parents to become more facilitators instead of dominators. Okay. And this is for parents and teachers, I should say. Um, so adults need to have a mindset shift, okay? They need to get away from controlling the IEP meeting to handing over the reins a little bit, like within reason, and teaching students to speak for themselves. Okay? And this needs to be intentional. So one way you can be intentional about this is having early skill building and not last minute preparation. Okay, so the whole let's have our IEPs together 48 hours beforehand, that probably needs to be a little earlier. Okay, so we need to start self advocacy instruction earlier, not just, and when I say earlier, I mean like, in elementary school, not just weeks before the IEP meeting. We need to have them at least be aware of their progress and pretty much the entire time. Okay, self determination develops gradually through repeated practice. All right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about making IEPs student centered. Um, and so there's a few ways that we can do this. We can involve students in all IEP areas. Okay, so not just transitions. We need to get away from that like idea that students are just they're just active in transitions. No, they need to be involved in the whole shebang. Can you imagine how cool it would be if a student were to tell you what they feel they need to work on in reading or in writing? How what that might mean if they felt that, they saw the purpose and they felt like they had a team behind them helping them to reach that goal. Okay. So we need to teach them to be active in all areas. Okay. And we can embed advocacy goals into their IEPs. Okay. So one thing that I learned recently for one of my classes, I had to critique my IEP. And I did this for a student who was on my caseload, and he was in one of the classes that I taught as well. And I realized as I was looking at his goals, I was like, you know what? His goal was to write a 5 paragraph essay. And I remember sitting in his IEP meeting and him saying, you know, I am not the best writer. He's like, the thoughts are there. I have all the thoughts. It's taking them and moving them or kind of breaking them down and getting them onto paper. And as I was thinking about his goal, I was like, he doesn't really need to know how to write a 5 paragraph essay. What he might need to know, though, or what he could work on is using assistive technology like speech to text. That might be a good self-advocacy goal as an example to work towards. Okay? So that was kind of a like wake up Rihanna moment for me. Um and so yeah, or it's okay to have advocacy goals. It just might look a little different in each of the content areas. And then, as far as educators go, we can provide professional development on student led practices. Okay. So, we can all be educated on how to support student led processes in IEPs. Okay. So, at the end of it all, it just is really about bringing students to the table. Okay. We can do that through early engagement. We need to center the student in their IEP process, and we really just want to make sure that we're preparing them for their future. Okay. Because their voice is the one that should guide the plan, not ours. Okay. They are Arthur. We are the knights of the round table trying to support them. Okay. And this is essential not only for compliance, but it's also good for ethics and for long term success for the student. So it's really important that we kind of bring them to the table there. And with that, I'm just going to leave us again with a congratulations, everybody, and best of luck at the beginning of the year. Um, yeah, thank you so much.